Hello and welcome again to Yesterday, Today and Tomorrow with Robin Ashby here on South Asia Global TV. I'm going to reflect on the history of Russia since 1900 through the lives of 5 notable women. The 20th century was one of tumult for the people of the Russian Empire, which became the Soviet Empire and is now Russia again. Its autocratic Tsar was executed and replaced by autocratic Soviets, mainly led by old men, and now an autocratic pretend democrat who seems to be trying to recreate the old empire. Through that time, the courage and talent of individual women shone through the darkness in the Russian soul. These are some of their stories. Nadia and the Night Witches. Nobody knows the exact date when they started calling us night witches. We were bombing the German positions every night, so the Germans began to say, "These are night witches," because it seemed impossible to kill us or shoot us down. So recalled Senior Lieutenant Serafima Amazoma Tarenko. In 1942, the Soviet Union was throwing everything into the fight to defend itself against Hitler's Germany, including its women. By GKO Order 0099, 3 regiments of women pilots, known as Aviation Group 122, were formed. These were the 588th Night Bombers, 587th Dive Bombers and 586 Yak Fighters regiments, under the command of Marina Raskova, a famous aviatrix. The bomb loader and the mechanic crews of the 588th were also all women. The 588th flew an old training biplane, the Polikarpov U-2 or PO-2, which carried no defensive weapons and was highly flammable. Its top speed was 94 miles an hour, that's 150 kilometers an hour, and it's less than the stall speed of the principal Nazi fighters, the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The pilots were able to turn this to their advantage by exploiting the plane's fantastic maneuverability and by the extraordinary disregard for personal safety. The Me-109, trying to intercept, would be frustrated by the PO-2 turning at a slower speed but with greater agility than it could manage, forcing it to make a wide pass and come in for another attempt to meet exactly the same tactic. On harassment bombing raids behind enemy lines, the canvas wings seemed to absorb radar, while the small 110 horsepower engine failed to register with infrared heat sensors. But it was noisy, so the pilots cut their engines and glided in over their unsuspecting targets. With its payload of only 2 small bombs, there was no margin for wastage. The only warning the Axis troops had of their approach was the wind whooshing through the wind tension wires as the PO-2 was upon them. Of negligible strategic value, these raids had a considerable psychological effect on their enemy. Their troops were the targets. They were hunkered down in encampments, supply depots, trying to rest between combat. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches, and they swooping in from a silent sky on their fantastical broomsticks. An iron cross was offered for each one downed. At Stalingrad, the Germans created what the Russians called a flak circus. Searchlights and flak guns, hidden by day, were brought out and positioned in concentric circles. In the linear flight path typical of untrained Russian flyers, the planes were shredded. But the 588th, flying in formations of 3, sent in the first 2 to fix the attention of the guns. These 2 would split off in opposite directions and try to evade the fire. The 3rd would sneak by undetected, drop her bombs and rejoin the others, while another of the original 2 would peel off to target. The Night Witches earned more than 20 Heroes of the Soviet Union medals and many Orders of the Red Banner, and participated in the final onslaught on Berlin. By the end of the war, most surviving pilots had chalked up nearly 1,000 combat missions. Former pilot Nadia Popov, who rode 18 sorties in one night, looked up into the cold night sky many years later and asked herself, "How did you do that, Nadia?" Polina the politician. Pearl Solomova-Karpovskaya was born on February the 5th, 1897 in the Zaporizhia Oblast in what's now Ukraine in the former Russian Empire to a Jewish family. Her father Solomon was a tailor. She met Vyacheslav Molotov during their university years in St. Petersburg. Molotov, or sledgehammer, was the nom de guerre of the sort which many revolutionaries adopted. Lenin was a man of steel, Stalin the man of iron. Throughout her political career, Polina used her nom de guerre of Comrade Zemchuzina, or Pearl, but I'll just call her Polina. She and Molotov shared principal political ideologies and became closely involved in the Bolshevik movement, which would eventually lead the Russian Revolution in 1917. She joined the Russian Social Democrat Labour Party of Bolsheviks in 1918 and served as a propaganda commissar in the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. After the revolution, Molotov rose through the ranks of the Communist Party, becoming one of Stalin's most trusted allies, serving as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. They married in 1920. Polina, known for her intelligence and dedication to the communist cause and to Stalin personally, also forged her career. She was the director of the Soviet National Cosmetics Trust from 1932 to 36, Minister, they call them People's Commissar of Fisheries in 1939, and head of textiles production in the Ministry of Light Industry from 1939 to 1948. During the 1930s, when Stalin's purges were at their height, Polina and her husband were deeply entrenched in the inner circle of power. The Molotovs had two daughters, Sonia, who was adopted in 1929, and Svetlana, born in 1930. They shared an apartment with Stalin's family. Polina and Stalin's wife Nadezhda Aliyeva became close friends. In November 1932, Polina followed Nadezhda out of the dining room after Stalin had publicly chastised his wife in the company of friends. The next morning, she was found dead by suicide, having shot herself with a small Walther PP pistol. This event is believed to have fueled a secret hatred of Polina by Stalin, who urged Molotov to divorce her. Despite his permanent subservience to Stalin, he refused to do so. During the dangers posed by Stalin's paranoia and the arbitrary nature of the purges, they managed to navigate the treacherous political landscape relatively unscathed. In the party, she was elected as a candidate member of the Central Committee in 1939. But in a secret meeting of the Politburo on the 10th of August 1939, of which Molotov was a member, the agenda item 33, regarding Comrade Zemchuzina and her alleged connection to spies, led to a request to verify that information by the NKVD secret police. As was customary during the Great Purges, many of her co-workers were arrested and questioned. But the evidence, mainly acquired by force against her, was so contradictory that on the 24th of October, the Politburo concluded the allegations against the comrades' participation in sabotage and spying are to be considered slanderous. However, she was severely reprimanded and demoted for unknowingly keeping contact with enemy elements, thereby facilitating their spying missions. In 1941, she was taken off the list of candidates for the Central Committee. Polina was arrested for treason in December 1948, consequently being forced into an unwanted divorce from Molotov, who seems not to have protested against her arrest. She was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in a labour camp. Despite what had happened during the Nazis' genocides, especially of Jews, Stalin had a streak of anti-Semitism. It may have contributed to his death from an untreated stroke in 1953 because an alleged doctor's plot had removed the Jewish doctor who might have saved him. Immediately afterwards, she was released from captivity by Beria, the head of the secret police, who was bidding for ultimate power, and reunited with her husband. Her first question upon her release was, "How's Stalin?" Upon being told that he died a few days earlier, she fainted. Molotov was briefly rehabilitated, but then dismissed by the post-Stalin regime. She and her husband were not actively involved in politics again, and they lived out the remaining years in relative obscurity in Moscow. She died in 1970. Valentina the cosmonaut. Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova was born on March 6, 1937, in the small village of Maslenikovo in western Russia. The daughter of factory workers, she was the first woman to go into space and a place in history. During the Cold War, an intense competition between the United States and the Union broke out. Major Yuri Gagarin had stunned the world when he became the first human to orbit the Earth. This sparked existential fear in the USA and a race between the two superpowers to achieve even greater feats of space exploration. In 1961, US President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and proposed that the US should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. In one of his inspirational speeches, his rallying cry was, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organise and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and we intend to win, and the others too." It was against this backdrop that the most unlikely future cosmonaut, Valentina, a textile worker and amateur parachutist, was selected from a pool of over 400 candidates to join the Soviet space program. On June 16, 1963, she embarked on her historic mission aboard the Vostok 6 spacecraft, becoming the first woman to fly in space. Her journey was uncomfortable as she grappled with weightlessness, cramped conditions, and the inherent dangers of space travel. For 3 days, she orbited the Earth 48 times, covering a distance of more than 70 million kilometers. 20 years and 2 days later, America sent its first woman into space. Valentina married cosmonaut Andrei Nikolaevich 9 months after her safe return at the Moscow wedding palace. Soviet leader Khrushchev presided at the wedding party together with top government and space program leaders. The marriage was encouraged or ordered by the Soviet space authorities as a fairy tale mission to the country. The head of the USSR space program described it as probably useful for politics and science. On 8th of June 1964, nearly 1 year after a space flight, she gave birth to their daughter Elena, the first person whose parents had both travelled in space. In the 1970s, they were divorced. In the years following her divorce, Valentina served the USSR as an ambassador for space exploration, travelling widely to promote scientific cooperation and international understanding. She retired from the Soviet Air Force as a Major General. She also pursued a career in politics, serving as a member of the Soviet Parliament and later, following the implosion of the USSR, the Russian Duma, where she advocated for the advancement of science and technology, and she is still a member. Aged 86, she's currently sanctioned by the USA for her support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Galina the dancer. The goddess of dance, arguably the greatest ballerina of the 20th century, was Galina Ulanova. The composer Serge Prokofiev said of her, "She is the genius of Russian ballet, its elusive soul, its inspired poetry. In classical roles, Ulanova reaches a depth of expression unprecedented in 20th century ballet." A classmate, the first Russian ballerina to visit the US under the Soviets, summed her up thus: "Ulanova is not a phenomenon who appeared out of the blue. Her talents stem from the depths of our Russian culture, our people, and given birth by a fine and harsh century." It was in pre-revolutionary St. Petersburg, where both her parents were involved with ballet, that she once rightly remarked that there was no choice following in their footsteps. Her father took her to her first performance when she was only 4. When she recognised her mother dancing one of the parts in The Sleeping Beauty, she startled the audience by shouting, "That's Mama, my Mama!" Her childhood memories included the revolutionary year of 1917, the summer that the police searched her parents' apartment. But her happier memories were backstage, taken there with her parents when they were scheduled to perform and there was no one to care for her. Her debut was in October 1928 in a performance of the Sleeping Beauty, the same ballet and the same theatre where she shouted out to her mother 14 years earlier. Her mother was present. "Doubly anxious," said Galina, "because as my teacher, she was thoroughly familiar with every difficult movement and with my weak points." She is reported to have covered her face when Galina moved into some of the more difficult portions of her performance as Princess Florina. "My technique was by no means what I could have wished," said Galina. The following year, however, she made her debut in a starring role, Odette Odile in Swan Lake. She professed she was influenced by new ideas of a revolutionary society. Dances were staged now not for the sake of a charming waltz or a galop tune, she said, but for the sake of expressing ideas and emotions. New ballet, aimed at conveying ideas, notably the basic idea of Soviet humanism, the idea of faith in man, his strength, beauty, his will to fight for happiness. After Germany's invasion, she spent many months entertaining troops at the front or performing for those on leave in Moscow and Leningrad. She danced in Moscow at the Bolshoi during the dangerous months of September and October 1941, when German forces threatened to capture the city. A glittering career of performance culminated in her coming to the attention of Stalin, who patronised her and ensured that she was permanently transferred to the Bolshoi in Moscow, becoming prima ballerina. One of the distinguished visitors before whom she performed was the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. For the rest of her career, she was showered with awards, several of them multiple times. Even in the depths of the Cold War, Galina's talent began to find a foreign audience. She was allowed to dance in Italy in 1951, receiving a tumultuous reception as the Dying Swan in Florence. After Stalin's death in 1953, the political pressures lessened and Galina became the outstanding star of Bolshoi's extensive foreign tours. Her most notable performances abroad came in England in 1956 and the United States in 1959. In these tours, she and other members of the Bolshoi undoubtedly benefited from the novelty of Soviet ballet for a Western audience, as well as the softening political climate. In London, the Bolshoi's impact was said to be as great as the Diaghilev ballet at the start of the century, and Galina, no longer young, had the greatest triumph of all. Acquaintances stressed two features of Alana's personality. First, her personal shyness. Second, was her fantastic daily application to her art through unending practice. Even among prima ballerinas, whose devotion to unending work is legendary, the star's devotion was seen as beyond the ordinary. In her autobiography, she noted, "Dancing is an art that demands endless, unremitting toil." Her goal, she said, was technical perfection. The public should never notice or suspect that any movements cost the dancer the least strain. Even in retirement as a performer, Galina remained an active and honoured figure in Russia and abroad. In her role of ballet coach, she accompanied the Bolshoi on tours abroad. Galina Ulanova died on April 25, 1998 in Moscow after a lengthy illness, aged 88. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of Russia, said of her, "Her life and the art of dance to which she has given her soul has become part of Russian and world culture. Ulanova has always been for us the symbol of conscience, honour and dignity. She is a true artist." Sasha the Protester. The Russian musician, writer and pacifist Sasha Skotchenko was sentenced to 7 years in prison in November 2023 for putting 5 small anti-war messages over price tags on items in a St. Petersburg supermarket in April 22. This was while the Russian army was besieging the city of Mariupol in Ukraine, subsequently reduced to rubble. One message read, "The Russian army bombed an art school in Mariupol where about 400 people were hiding from shelling." Another, "Weekly inflation reached a new high not seen since 1998 because our military actions in Ukraine stopped the war." Although what she said was true, Sasha was charged with spreading knowingly false information about the Russian army motivated by political hatred. New laws have criminalised virtually anything perceived as criticism of the war or Russia's armed forces. Until recently, even the war could not be referred to in Russia as a war, but must be called a special military operation. A guilty verdict was inevitable. She has since been declared a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. Paradoxically, Sasha's prosecution gave her a platform to speak against the war and potentially to persuade other Russians to join her in embracing the truth. Sasha Skochelenko was born in 1990, the year before the Soviet Union collapsed and the city of her birth reverted to its historic name of St. Petersburg. As Russia entered a new era, everyone in the country was hoping for change, waiting for democracy and freedom. But unfortunately, there were only small changes, Sasha's mother, Nadezhda, has written. Although often ill as a child, Sasha took pleasure in art, writing poems and organising music jam sessions, her mother said. Even those who never played music could come and play and improvise at any time, she said. It was music, just without notes. But because it was from the heart, everyone loved it. Sasha also wrote short books in graphic form about her depression and bipolar disease. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Sasha believed she should do everything possible to stop the war, to tell those who do not know the truth about what's happening, her mother says. That's why she decided to make such an action in the store for those people who don't know the truth. While in detention for many months awaiting trial, she suffered bullying and denial of medicines, gluten-free food for celiac disease and access to the toilet. Court sessions were also physically demanding, requiring her to stand and nothing to drink for hours. Yet, the proceedings were also a source of support as friends and strangers rallied to her defence. Her lawyers dismantled the case against her, discrediting prosecution witness testimony. Sasha herself rebutted an element of the charge against her, saying she wanted to stop the war not out of hatred but out of animosity, but out of compassion. In a final statement to the court, Skochelenko said of the state prosecutor, "He believes in a very different truth to me. I would never imprison him for that." To him, she said, "I don't blame you. You're looking out for your career, a stable future to provide for your family." Ultimately, despite facing long imprisonment, Sasha told the judge and the prosecutor, "I am freer than you." Sasha wondered in court how the regime could believe itself threatened by 5 small pieces of paper. An investigator told her lawyer he resigned because "I didn't join the investigative committee to work on cases like the one against Sasha." Prison staff have expressed bafflement. Do they really put people in prison for this now? According to Natalia Arno, the president of the Free Russia Foundation, an organisation of exiles who support democracy and oppose the war in Ukraine, Sasha has become one of the symbols of the anti-war protest movement globally. She is one of the reasons we are not ashamed to be Russian. With special thanks to Elaine Jude and Tim Berners-Lee, this has been Yesterday, Today and Tomorrow with Robin Ashby.